The role of relationships in addiction. Understanding emotional drivers like codependency and love addiction. When we think about addiction, most of us focus on substances like alcohol or drugs. But addiction also shows up in our relationships in ways that are often harder to recognize. Emotional drivers like the need for control, the desire for escape, or even a craving for arousal can fuel these unhealthy patterns. Today, we're diving into how addiction manifests in relationships. We'll explore patterns like codependency, love addiction, and traumatic bonding. And I'll explain how these emotional drivers, arousal, control, escape, and numbness, fuel these types of relationships and keep you stuck. Defining relationship-based addictions. Let's start by defining some key terms. Relationship-based addictions come in many forms, but they all share the same emotional drivers that fuel other types of addictions, like substances or behaviors. Codependency, for example, is when your sense of self-worth becomes tied to another person, leading you to feel responsible for their happiness. It's less about love and more about control. The need to feel needed. The fear of being abandoned. Love addiction is similar, but revolves around the need for romantic intensity and arousal. This addiction thrives on the highs and lows of romance, constantly seeking that next dopamine hit from a new relationship or from dramatic ups and downs without an existing. Traumatic bonding, on the other hand, develops in abusive relationships. The intense emotional highs and lows create a deep attachment that mimics addiction. You become bonded to the person, not in spite of the trauma, but because of it, making it incredibly hard to break free. Have you ever found yourself staying in a relationship even when you know it's unhealthy? Do you feel a strong pull towards someone even when they're not treating you well? These are signs that emotional drivers like arousal, control, and numbness are at play. How emotional drivers fuel relationship addictions. So, how do these relationship-based addictions develop? It all comes back to emotional drivers, those underlying feelings that keep us hooked. For example, when it comes to codependency, control is the dominant driver. You feel the need to control the relationship, not out of malice, but because it gives you a sense of safety. And then there's arousal and pleasure, which drive love addiction and co-sex addiction. These addictions are by the emotional highs of romance, sex, or even the thrill of being desired. It becomes less about the person and more about chasing that feeling. The rush, the excitement, the escape from everyday life. Fantasy and escape also play a huge role, especially in romance and limerence. Limerence is that obsessive infatuation with someone where you build up an idealized version of them in your mind. You escape into this fantasy, which can be intoxicating. but it keeps you from facing reality. Here's how these emotional drivers fit into the different types of relationship addictions. Codependency. Driven by control and restriction, needing to manage the other person to feel secure. Co-sex addiction. Also driven by arousal, but with a stronger connection to physical pleasure and validation. Traumatic bonding. A complex mix of control and numbness where the trauma creates an intense emotional bond. Romance and limerence. Rooted in fantasy and escape, building up an unrealistic image of someone in order to avoid facing emotional wounds. Self-appearance obsession, tied to control and arousal, where your appearance becomes a way to manage how others see you and validate your worth. Which emotional driver resonates most with you? Is it the need to control, to escape, to feel the highs of arousal and pleasure? Recognizing these drivers is the first step in breaking free from unhealthy relationship patterns. Steps to break free from relationship-based addictions. Breaking free from these addictions isn't easy, but it starts with awareness. First, identify the emotional driver that's keeping you stuck. Is it control, arousal, fantasy, or numbness? Once you know what's driving your behavior, you could start to address it directly. Here's a few steps to get started. Acknowledge the driver. Write down what emotional need you're trying to fulfill through the relationship. Create boundaries. If control is your driver, start by setting healthy boundaries in the relationship. Focus on reality. If fantasy and escape are driving you, ground yourself in reality by journaling or talking to a trusted friend about what's really happening in the relationship. Seek support, whether through therapy, support groups, online resources, or speaking with a medical professional. Get the help you need to start breaking free from these patterns. Think about the relationships in your life. Are any of them driven by these emotional needs? What's one small step you can take today to start addressing that drive? Relationships play a huge role in addiction, but they're not the only factor. In the next video, I'll be talking about how these same emotional drivers, control, arousal, and escape, show up in our behaviors, like overeating, work addiction, or even media. We'll dive in to how to recognize these patterns and start breaking free. If you're ready to take the next step in healing, hit subscribe and drop a comment below. What emotional driver have you recognized in your relationships? And what's your plan for moving forward? Let's keep the conversation going. Thank you and take care.